Well, welcome to episode 347 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about this really excellent record by Andrew Hill, Point of Departure, which was released on Blue Note in 1965. It was made in 1964. As you can see, it has a tremendous sextet lineup, including people like Eric Dolphy and Joe Henderson and Richard Davis on this date. This copy is a 1967 reissue. It's one of those Division of Liberty Records reissues, which are very much worth collecting. It has the all-important Van Gelder stamp. Andrew Hill is a fascinating figure in jazz history. He's associated to a degree with the avant-garde jazz scene in the 1960s, but he was nevertheless accessible enough for Blue Note, who were hardly edgelords as a label, to include him on some straight-ahead bop dates. And that may be because his own avant-gardeness wasn't so much a feature of him following trends as it was something which was a manifestation of his own deeply personal internal musical vision. In fact, his emergence as a bit of a hero of the avant-garde kind of comes out of the blue. He was pretty obscure until he was championed by Alfred Lion, the owner of Blue Note, in the mid-1960s. He then records a flurry of records when he's signed to the label in 1963, and the general, if not the universal consensus, is that this record is the best of the lot. I dwelt previously on Andrew Hill's early life and career when I reviewed his first record for Blue Note, Black Fire. For much of the 1950s, Hill was active on the jazz scene in Chicago's South Side, usually as a leader. He makes his first recording in 1956 on a little label called Ping Records with a single called After Dark. In this period, he also found work as a sideman for a number of singers, including Johnny Hartman and Al Hibbler. And as the decade wore on, he leads a trio which starts to become one of significant renown in Chicago, with Malachi Favors on bass. Malachi Favors, of course, would go on to be part of the Art Ensemble of Chicago. They make a record in 1960 called So in Love, which doesn't do too much. And interestingly, although it's not a bad record, is a very straight ahead, hard bop-ish piano trio record. There was really no hint of what's about to come when he starts recording for Blue Note just a few years later. That record didn't really cause his career to lift off, but he did start to get bigger and bigger gigs after this point. He moved to New York in 1961 to be the accompanist for Dinah Washington. And then in 1962, for reasons which are kind of obscure, he moves out to LA and he starts working with Rahsaan Roland Kirk. And if there's any single reason why Hill transforms from being this straight ahead Bud Powell influenced piano player to a much more angular, sometimes challenging composer and performer in the mid-1960s, it may well be this exposure to Kirk, who took a backseat to nobody when it came to challenging boundaries. In Hill's time in LA, he also spends time playing at the famous Lighthouse Cafe in Hermosa Beach, and in fact, there's a track on his later record Smokestack called 30 Pier Avenue, which is named after the address of the lighthouse. In early 1963, Hill marries his first wife, Laverne, and they move right away back to New York City. And here begins an absolute whirlwind 6 months of connections, introductions, recommendations, hunches, and maybe even a little bit of manic behavior on the part of a record label. Once back in New York, Hill got work right away with the trumpeter Kenny Dorham's quintet, and he also became good friends and jamming buddies with the young tenor sax player in the quintet, Joe Henderson. Henderson had come of age in the Detroit jazz scene. He'd done 2 years in the Army between 1960 and 1962, and when he was discharged, he'd moved to New York where he'd met Kenny Dorham. Kenny Dorham, of course, had mixed in Blue Note circles for years and years, and he had a recording date coming up on April 1st, 1963, to make his record Una Mas. For that record, Dorham told Alfred Lion he wanted to bring in this new guy in his quintet, Joe Henderson, on tenor. When Lion heard Henderson, he absolutely loved him, and he recorded him as a leader in his own right just 2 months later. That's Henderson's record, Page One. That happens in June '63, and recall that Henderson and Andrew Hill have been jamming together. In September, Blue Note had another recording date for Henderson, and Henderson says to Alfred Lion, listen, I want to bring in this guy in piano I've been jamming with, who's also in the Dorham Quintet, Andrew Hill. From the moment that Andrew Hill first plays a note in Rudy Van Gelder's recording studio, Alfred Lion thinks he's amazing, and he says, look, come back in 3 weeks. I've got a recording date with Hank Mobley. That would be the record, No Room for Squares. I want you to play piano on that. When Hill comes back for the Hank Mobley sessions, Lion has already heard that Hill has been writing his own material, and so he says, look, can you play me some of your own stuff? He is amazed both with the quality of Hill's compositions, but also the sheer number of them. Then and there, 3 weeks after meeting Hill, he signs him to a multi-record deal, and he would subsequently refer to Hill as his last great discovery or his last great protege. For Alfred Lion, Andrew Hill was in a musical club which really only had two other members, Thelonious Monk and Herbie Nichols, both also piano players. And all three of these musicians had, in their own way, basically hit Alfred Lion like a thunderbolt. Lyon would say later to interviewers that he felt such was the quality of their original work that anything he could record of theirs, he should record. And if you know anything about the history of Blue Note, this is absolutely classic Alfred Lyon. It's all about the music. It's not really about what the label could sustain, but his good fortune, and ours, is that his taste tended to align with things that were commercially viable. It's also worth noting that Hill and Lyon and Frank Wolff, the co-owner of Blue Note, all got along extremely well. Andrew Hill was an extremely bright guy, had all kinds of interests outside of music, and they all found each other very engaging. And this friendship, no doubt, furthers Lyon's commitment to Hill. Whatever the reasons are, Lyon's recording of Andrew Hill in the next few months borders on the manic. In November 1963, he records his debut, Blackfire. That's followed by Smokestack in December of that year. January 1964 is Judgment, and then in March, this record is made, and that's followed by Andrew in June 1964. So if you're keeping track, that's 5 albums in a little bit less than 8 months. Of course, given the economics of the record industry at the time, this wasn't really sustainable because you couldn't really flood the market with a whole bunch of records by a single artist. These start to be released in dribs and drabs and delayed, and some are actually held back for quite some time. So there has since been a long drip, drip, drip of Andrew Hill Blue Note releases. This record is made on March 21st, 1964, at Rudy Van Gelder's studio in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. Andrew Hill, of course, is on piano. His quintet leader at the time, Kenny Dorham, is on trumpet. His other bandmate, Joe Henderson, is on tenor sax and also doubles on one track on flute. The great bassist Richard Davis, for my money, probably the greatest bassist of the 1960s, is on bass. Tony Williams, by this point Miles Davis's regular drummer, is behind the kit. And Eric Dolphy is on alto sax, bass clarinet, and flute. Dolphy's appearance on here is momentous, not least because, as far as I can tell, it's his last recording ever in America. He was at that point feeling harassed by the critics. He'd announced that he was moving to Europe to get away and to be able to play the music that he wanted to play. But within 3 months, very sadly, he would die in Berlin of an undiagnosed diabetic coma. This record has 5 excellent and fascinating compositions by Andrew Hill, and the first of those is Refuge, which kicks off side 1. This has Dolphy on alto. It's an exciting track from start to finish. The solos are amazing, in part because they're all so distinct from one another. Hill is kind of intellectual, Dolphy is this flurry of angular lines. Dorham, as you might expect from his pedigree, is more melodic. Davis's bass and Henderson's tenor are both punchy, and then Henderson really starts to rip in the way that he can. It is just a thrilling track. The other track on side 1 is New Monastery, so named because Frank Wolff apparently thought it sounded like something Monk had once recorded, so I guess a little ecclesiastical humor in the titling there. Kenny Dorham leads off the soloing. It's impressive to hear him on what is a pretty avant-garde date, or a reasonably avant-garde date anyway, even if I think he's probably the least convincing of the sextet in that field. The first track on side 2 is Spectrum, in which Hill is trying to reflect a bunch of different emotions in what are basically a number of different mini movements in a relatively short track. And he's helped, I think, by the fact that both Dolphy and Henderson, well, Dolphy's playing 3 different instruments on this track, the bass clarinet, the sax, and the flute, and Henderson's also playing sax and flute. So you get a whole bunch of different textures here. That's augmented by Dorham's muted trumpet. And I haven't mentioned Williams or Davis so far, but their performances throughout this record are just exemplary. They take space, they seed space really intuitively. It really is a very organic feeling grouping. Flight 19 is almost jaunty at the start. It's very much a collective piece. There are some solos, but again, they're all kind of woven into one collective piece. The final track, Dedication, is a piece about loss. This is maybe the most beautiful piece on the record, particularly Dolphy's bass clarinet playing, which is just fantastic. This record is one of those ones that really lives up to its billing. It lives up to the hype. But I would add a caution that if you're a fan of straight ahead jazz, you may find this record a little bit challenging, even though it's a big seller for Blue Note, because a lot of the playing is, what you might call outside rather than inside jazz. Hill's on top of his game, both in terms of his playing and his compositions. Dolphy, in particular, is absolutely liberated here, and his contribution is maybe the most thrilling of anybody's on this record. But it's not just about those two. This is an all-star lineup, which is clearly inspired by Hill's compositions. It's a must-have record, I think, and for me, it's 5 out of 5 stars.